The bass thumped through the walls of Neptune's Den, a popular waterfront club in San Diego, where military personnel often gathered after long deployments. The neon lights cast shifting shadows across the crowded dance floor, and the air was thick with excitement and the promise of weekend freedom. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen sat quietly at the far end of the mahogany bar, nursing a glass of sparkling water with lime. At 42, she carried herself with an understated confidence that came from years of command responsibility. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, dark jeans and a navy blue blouse that revealed nothing of her military rank or the weight of responsibility she carried on her shoulders. Sarah had come to the club reluctantly, convinced by her aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Rodriguez, that she needed to decompress after the intense 3-week naval exercises in the Pacific. The exercises had involved coordinating 12 destroyers, 2 aircraft carriers, and over 30,000 personnel across international waters. As the commanding officer overseeing the entire operation, Sarah had barely slept during those weeks, managing diplomatic tensions with 3 allied nations while ensuring mission success. Now, sitting in this crowded civilian space, she felt oddly out of place. The music was too loud, the conversations too casual, and the atmosphere too relaxed for someone who had spent the last decade making decisions that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars in military assets. "Another water?" asked the bartender, a friendly man in his 30s with tattooed forearms. "Please," Sarah replied with a slight smile. She checked her watch, 9:30 p.m. She had promised Rodriguez she would stay for at least an hour to be normal, as he had put it. 30 more minutes, and she could return to her quarters to review the post-exercise reports that awaited her attention. The crowd near the dance floor suddenly erupted in cheers and laughter. Sarah turned to see what was happening and noticed a group of men in their 20s and 30s, clearly military by their bearing and haircuts, even though they were dressed in civilian clothes. They were celebrating something, raising their beer bottles in synchronized toasts. One man stood out from the group. He was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of rigid posture and alert eyes that Sarah recognized immediately: special operations. His dark hair was cut in a precise military style, and even in the dim club lighting, she could see the confidence that radiated from him like heat from a fire. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tank Rodriguez, no relation to Sarah's aide, was indeed celebrating. His SEAL team had just returned from a successful counterterrorism operation in Southeast Asia, and after 2 months of classified missions and constant danger, they had finally been granted shore leave. At 29, Tank was at the peak of his physical and mental capabilities, a decorated warrior who had earned his nickname not just for his imposing build, but for his ability to push through any obstacle. "Another round," Tank called out to his teammates, his voice carrying easily over the music. His crew, 6 other SEALs from Team 3, cheered their approval. They had been through hell together, and now they were determined to enjoy their freedom. Tank's eyes scanned the club with the automatic awareness that had been drilled into him through years of training. He cataloged exits, potential threats, and civilian populations with the same intensity he brought to combat zones. It was a habit he couldn't turn off, even in a supposedly safe environment. His gaze fell on Sarah at the bar. She was sitting alone, which immediately caught his attention. In his experience, attractive women in clubs were usually surrounded by admirers or dancing with friends. This woman was different. She held herself with a certain reserve, a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the chaotic energy of the club. "Check out the Ice Queen at the bar," said Petty Officer First Class Jake Williams, following Tank's gaze. "Been sitting there alone for the past hour. Somebody's got some serious walls up." Tank studied Sarah more carefully. There was something about her posture, the way she observed the room without seeming to participate in it, that triggered his professional curiosity. She wasn't just antisocial. She was watching, evaluating, maintaining situational awareness in the same way he was. Maybe she just needs someone to show her how to have a good time, Tank said, the confidence in his voice reflecting years of successful missions and personal conquests. In his world, problems were meant to be solved through direct action, and challenges were opportunities to prove his capabilities. His teammates exchanged knowing looks. Tank had a reputation for his success with women, but more than that, he had an almost compulsive need to take on challenges. Whether it was a particularly difficult training exercise, a dangerous mission, or an unimpressed woman in a bar, Tank approached obstacles with the same determined intensity. $20 says she shuts you down in under 2 minutes, Williams bet, grinning. Make it 50, Tank replied, straightening his shoulders, and prepare to pay up. Sarah was aware of the approaching figure before Tank reached the bar. Her peripheral vision had caught his movement, and her trained awareness had cataloged his approach vector and probable intentions. She didn't turn to look at him directly, but she tensed slightly, the way someone does when they sense an incoming social interaction they'd rather avoid. Tank slid smoothly onto the bar stool next to her, signaling the bartender with practiced ease. "Jack and Coke," he ordered, then turned to face Sarah with his most charming smile. "Kinda loud in here, isn't it?" Sarah glanced at him briefly, taking in his appearance and bearing in a single assessment. Military, special forces, probably Navy based on the location. Confident to the point of arrogance, accustomed to getting what he wanted through force of personality. She had dealt with hundreds of men like him throughout her career. "I hadn't noticed," she replied politely but coolly, turning her attention back to her water glass. Tank was undeterred. If anything, her dismissive response only increased his interest. "I'm Tank," he said, extending his hand. "I don't think I've seen you here before." "I don't come here often," Sarah replied, glancing at his offered hand, but not taking it. She had learned long ago that the first sign of weakness in a conversation with an aggressive personality was allowing them to establish physical contact and social dominance. Tank let his hand drop, but his smile widened. "Let me guess. You're not from around here? Visiting San Diego? Business trip?" Sarah turned to face him more directly, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. "And let me guess. You're military, probably special operations based on your posture and the way you scan the room. You're celebrating something with your team over there, and you decided to come over here because you thought I looked like I needed company." Tank's eyebrows rose in surprise. Most civilians couldn't read military bearing so accurately, and very few people had ever analyzed him so quickly and precisely. "Impressive," he said, genuinely intrigued now. "You've got a good eye. Are you military yourself?" "I work for the Navy," Sarah said carefully, which was technically true. As a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, she did indeed work for the organization, though her position was far more complex than the simple phrase suggested. "Civilian contractor?" Tank asked, his interest sharpening. "Intelligence? Logistics?" Sarah smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of amusement she had shown. "Something like that." Tank leaned closer, dropping his voice to what he probably thought was an intimate level. "You know, I've been deployed for the past 2 months. Classified stuff. Can't really talk about it, but let's just say it was pretty intense. Been looking forward to unwinding with some good company." The implication in his voice was clear, and Sarah felt the familiar irritation that came with being treated as a recreational opportunity rather than a person. She had spent her entire adult life proving that she belonged in spaces dominated by men, and she was tired of conversations that began with assumptions about what she was there to provide. "I'm sure you have," she said, her tone becoming noticeably cooler. "And I'm sure you're very good at your job. But I'm not interested in helping you unwind." Tank's expression hardened slightly. In his experience, direct rejection usually meant he needed to demonstrate his value more clearly. Women, in his understanding, were impressed by strength, confidence, and status. If subtle approaches weren't working, perhaps a more direct demonstration was required. "Look," he said, his voice taking on a slightly more aggressive edge. "I don't think you understand what you're turning down here. I'm not just some regular grunt. I'm a Navy SEAL, Team 3. Do you know what that means?" Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have some idea. I've been to places you couldn't pronounce, done things that would give most people nightmares. I've jumped out of airplanes into hostile territory, swum through enemy waters, and eliminated targets that threatened American security. I'm not some weekend warrior or desk jockey." The conversation was attracting attention from other patrons nearby. Tank's voice had risen slightly, and his posture had become more imposing. Sarah noticed that his teammates were watching with interest, and several other club-goers had turned to observe what appeared to be an increasingly tense interaction. "I'm sure that's very impressive," Sarah said quietly, her own training in crisis de-escalation coming into play. "But it doesn't change the fact that I'm not interested in conversation right now." Tank's ego, already inflated by alcohol and the adrenaline of recent mission success, took her continued rejection as a personal challenge. In his world, people respected strength and authority. Civilians, especially, were supposed to be impressed by military accomplishments and special operations credentials. "Maybe you don't understand the kind of person you're dealing with," Tank said, standing up from his stool so that his 6'2" frame towered over Sarah's seated position. "I don't get told no very often, especially not by some Navy contractor who probably shuffles paperwork all day." Sarah remained seated, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Anyone with military training would have recognized the subtle change, the way her weight settled into a more balanced position, the slight adjustment of her hands, the way her breathing steadied. She was preparing for a confrontation, not out of fear, but out of professional assessment of a potentially volatile situation. "I think you should return to your friends," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm but carrying an undertone of steel that Tank was too drunk and too ego-driven to recognize. "I'm not looking for trouble, and I don't think you really want to cause a scene in a public place." Tank's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Trouble? Lady, you have no idea what trouble looks like. I've seen more action in the past month than you've probably seen in your entire life. I've led missions behind enemy lines, coordinated with international forces, and made decisions under pressure that you couldn't even imagine." Sarah's expression had gone completely neutral, the kind of professional mask that high-ranking military officers develop when dealing with insubordinate personnel. She was no longer seeing Tank as a drunk civilian causing problems in a bar. She was seeing him as a subordinate who was completely out of line and creating a situation that could reflect poorly on his unit, his service, and the broader military community. "Petty officer," she said quietly, using his rank, although he hadn't mentioned it. "I think you've had enough to drink tonight." Tank froze. The use of his military rank by someone he had assumed was a civilian contractor sent a shock of recognition through his alcohol-clouded brain. But his ego and the momentum of the confrontation pushed him forward even as warning bells began ringing in the back of his mind. "How do you know my rank?" he demanded, his voice becoming more aggressive. "And what gives you the right to tell me what I've had to drink?" Sarah stood up slowly, her 5'6" frame dwarfed by Tank's imposing build. But something about the way she carried herself, the absolute confidence in her movements, made several nearby conversations stop entirely. The bartender had noticed the tension and was reaching for his phone, probably to call security. "I know your rank because I know how to read military bearing and behavior," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. "And as for what gives me the right, well, that's a longer conversation than we need to have in a civilian establishment." Tank's teammates had noticed that something was wrong. The playful energy of their celebration had shifted to concern as they watched their usually unflappable leader engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly serious confrontation with a lone woman at the bar. Williams started to approach, but Tank waved him off with a sharp gesture. His pride wouldn't allow his teammates to see him back down from a confrontation, especially not with someone he had assumed was a civilian. "You're bluffing," Tank said. But there was less certainty in his voice now. "You're trying to intimidate me with some kind of fake authority. Well, I've got news for you. I don't intimidate easily. I've faced down terrorists and enemy combatants. Some Navy contractor trying to sound official doesn't scare me." Sarah reached into her purse, a movement so casual and confident that Tank didn't think to stop her. What she pulled out was a simple black wallet, which she opened to reveal a military identification card. Tank's eyes focused on the card, and the color drained from his face as he read the information displayed there. The photograph was clearly Sarah, but the rank and position listed made his stomach drop like a stone. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, United States Navy. But that wasn't what made Tank's world suddenly tilt on its axis. Below her rank and name was her current assignment: Commanding Officer, Pacific Fleet Operations. Tank stared at the identification for several long seconds, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. Pacific Fleet Operations was responsible for coordinating naval activities across the entire Pacific Ocean. The commanding officer of that organization wasn't just some desk jockey or contractor. She was one of the most powerful and important naval officers in the entire United States military. Sarah closed the wallet and returned it to her purse, her movements deliberate and calm. "Now," she said quietly, "I'm going to suggest one more time that you return to your friends and enjoy the rest of your evening. And I'm going to pretend that this conversation never happened, because I have better things to do than write disciplinary reports about decorated SEALs who can't handle their alcohol." Tank opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His entire understanding of the situation had shifted so dramatically that he felt dizzy. This wasn't just some civilian he had been trying to impress and intimidate. This was a superior officer, whose rank and authority were so far above his own that the very idea of his behavior was not just inappropriate, but potentially career-ending. The weight of military protocol, respect for chain of command, and the sudden understanding of just how badly he had miscalculated came crashing down on Tank's consciousness like a physical blow. He took a step backward, his aggressive posture collapsing into something much more uncertain. "Ma'am," he began, his voice hoarse with shock and the beginning of genuine panic. I didn't." Sarah held up one hand, stopping his words. "Petty Officer Rodriguez, you're going to walk away now. You're going to rejoin your teammates, and you're going to have a conversation with them about appropriate behavior when representing the Navy in civilian establishments. And then you're all going to go home and sleep this off." Tank nodded numbly, the fight completely gone out of him. But as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, questions started forming in his mind. Questions about who this woman really was, how she had risen to such a position of authority, and what kind of career and life experiences had created the quiet confidence he had mistaken for weakness. The bar around them had returned to normal volume, but Tank was acutely aware that their conversation had been observed by multiple people. His teammates were staring at him with expressions of confusion and concern, waiting for some explanation of why their normally unshakable leader looked like he had just been struck by lightning. Sarah picked up her purse and stood to leave, but Tank found his voice again. "Ma'am," he said, his tone now properly respectful but still filled with confusion. Can I ask how Pacific Fleet Operations is..." Sarah paused and looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. "How did someone like me end up in a position like that?" she asked. Reading his unfinished question accurately, Tank nodded, his curiosity overriding his embarrassment. "That," Sarah said with the slightest hint of a smile, "is a very long story." Tank stood frozen as Sarah walked toward the exit, his mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. His teammates approached cautiously, having witnessed the tail end of the confrontation but missing the crucial revelation that had transformed their confident leader into a man who looked like he'd just witnessed his own career exploding before his eyes. "Tank, what the hell just happened?" Williams asked, his voice low but urgent. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Tank couldn't immediately find words. "How do you explain to your fellow SEALs that you just tried to intimidate someone who could probably have your entire team reassigned to the most unpleasant duties imaginable with a single phone call? How do you admit that your legendary confidence had led you to completely misread a situation in the most spectacular way possible?" "We need to leave," Tank said quietly, still staring at the exit where Sarah had disappeared. "Right now." "Leave? Man, we just got here." "The night's still young and there's plenty of action left," said Petty Officer Second Class Danny Morrison, clearly confused by Tank's sudden change in demeanor. "I said we're leaving," Tank repeated, his tone carrying enough authority that his teammates knew not to argue further. They gathered their belongings and headed for the exit, exchanging concerned glances but following their leader's directive without question. Outside the club, Tank leaned against the brick wall and tried to collect his thoughts. The cool night air helped clear some of the alcohol-induced fog from his brain, but it also made the reality of what had just occurred that much sharper and more painful. "Tank, seriously, what happened in there?" Williams pressed. "You went from cruise control to complete shutdown in about 30 seconds. Tank looked at his teammates, men he had served with through some of the most dangerous missions the Navy had to offer, men whose lives he had held in his hands and who had trusted him with theirs. They deserved an explanation, even if that explanation made him look like a complete fool. "That woman I was talking to," Tank began slowly, "I thought she was just some civilian contractor. Maybe intelligence, maybe logistics, somebody who shuffles papers and stays safely behind a desk while real warriors do the fighting." "Okay," Williams said, sensing there was more to the story. "And?" "She's Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen," Tank continued, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Commanding Officer, Pacific Fleet Operations." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's jaw dropped open. Williams actually took a step backward as if Tank had physically struck him. The other members of the team exchanged looks of horror and disbelief. "Jesus Christ, Tank," Williams whispered. "Pacific Fleet Operations? That's like, that woman commands more firepower than most small countries." Tank nodded miserably. "And I tried to intimidate her by telling her about my special operations experience and how she couldn't possibly understand what real military service looks like." The full magnitude of Tank's mistake was beginning to sink in for all of them. Pacific Fleet Operations wasn't just another naval command. It was the organizational nerve center for the entire Western Pacific, coordinating everything from routine patrols to major international military exercises. The commanding officer of that organization would have authority over aircraft carrier battle groups, submarine fleets, marine expeditionary forces, and special operations units across half the world's largest ocean. "How did you find out?" Morrison asked, his voice barely audible. "She showed me her ID," Tank replied. "After I told her she probably shuffles paperwork all day and couldn't understand what real military service looks like." Williams actually groaned out loud. "Tank, please tell me you didn't say that to her face." "I said that and worse," Tank admitted. "I told her I don't get told no very often. I stood over her trying to physically intimidate her. I called her bluff when she tried to de-escalate the situation." The team stood in stunned silence, each man contemplating the potential ramifications of their leader's spectacular error in judgment. In the military, respect for rank and chain of command wasn't just tradition. It was the foundation that held the entire organization together. What Tank had done went beyond simple disrespect into the realm of career-ending misconduct. Meanwhile, Sarah had reached her car in the club's parking lot. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes, not starting the engine, processing her own emotions about what had just occurred. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her based on her appearance, or assumed that her authority was somehow illegitimate, but it never got easier to deal with. She thought about Tank's shocked expression when he realized who she was. There had been genuine horror there, not just fear of consequences, but something deeper. The realization that he had fundamentally misjudged not just her position, but her entire existence. It was a look she had seen before, though rarely so dramatically displayed. Sarah's rise through the naval hierarchy had been neither quick nor easy. She had graduated from the Naval Academy 20 years earlier as one of only 43 women in a class of over 1,000 midshipmen. Her first assignment had been aboard a destroyer where she was one of only 12 female officers among a crew of 320 sailors and officers. She remembered those early years with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. Every day had been a test, every interaction a potential challenge to prove that she belonged. She had worked longer hours than her male counterparts, studied harder, performed better, and still faced constant questions about her competence and commitment. The assumption seemed to be that women in the Navy were temporary visitors who would eventually leave for marriage and motherhood, not serious career officers worthy of real responsibility. Sarah had proven those assumptions wrong through 2 decades of exceptional performance. She had served aboard 6 different ships, commanded a destroyer squadron, completed multiple deployments to the Middle East and Asia, and earned advanced degrees in international relations and strategic studies. Her rise to command of Pacific Fleet operations had come after a decade of increasingly responsible positions, each one earned through measurable results and peer recognition. But sitting in the parking lot of Neptune's den, Sarah felt the familiar weight of isolation that came with her position. The higher she rose in rank and responsibility, the fewer peers she had, the fewer people who could understand the pressures she faced, and the more careful she had to be about every interaction and decision. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Rodriguez. "Hope you're having fun being normal. Try not to work while you're out." Sarah smiled despite her mood. Rodriguez meant well, but normal was something that had become increasingly elusive as her career progressed. Normal people didn't carry the responsibility for coordinating military operations across the world's largest ocean. Normal people didn't make decisions that could affect international relations and global security. Normal people didn't have to constantly prove their right to exist in spaces dominated by men who assumed their presence was either decorative or temporary. Back at the club entrance, Tank was still trying to explain the situation to his increasingly concerned teammates. "Look," he said, "the bottom line is that I screwed up massively. I let my ego and alcohol make me act like an idiot, and now we all need to hope this doesn't come back to bite us." "What do you think will happen?" asked Petty Officer 3rd Class Alex Kumar, the youngest member of their team. "I mean, will she report this? Could this affect our security clearances?" Tank shook his head. "I don't know. She said she was going to pretend the conversation never happened, but that was before I completely lost my mind and challenged her authority. At this point, she'd be well within her rights to make official note of the incident." Williams was thinking strategically, the way SEALs were trained to approach complex problems. "What do we know about her? I mean, beyond the rank and position. How did someone get to that level of command?" It was a fair question. None of them had ever encountered a female officer at such a high level of command authority, and their understanding of how someone achieved such a position was limited. In their experience, the pathway to senior leadership was through combat commands, special operations experience, and the kind of aggressive leadership style that Tank himself embodied. "We could look her up," Morrison suggested. "I mean, someone in her position would have a public record of service achievements and major assignments." Tank considered this. Part of him wanted to simply pretend the entire incident had never happened and hoped that Sarah's promise to forget about it would hold true. But another part of him, the professional warrior who prided himself on understanding his environment and the people in it, was genuinely curious about how someone had reached such a level of authority without him ever being aware of their existence. "Yeah," Tank said finally, "let's find out who we're dealing with." The team walked several blocks to a 24-hour internet cafe, a somewhat shabby establishment that catered to people who needed computer access at odd hours. Tank paid for an hour of computer time and began searching for information about Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen. What he found in the first few minutes of searching fundamentally altered his understanding of naval leadership and combat experience. Sarah's official biography read like a catalog of exactly the kind of achievements Tank respected. Multiple combat deployments during the height of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, command of a destroyer during anti-piracy operations off Somalia, coordination of international naval exercises involving forces from 12 different countries, and completion of the Navy's most demanding leadership training programs. But it was the details that began to reshape Tank's perspective. Sarah had commanded a destroyer squadron during a crisis in the South China Sea that had nearly escalated into armed conflict between the United States and China. Her decisions during a 72-hour period of extreme tension had not only prevented military confrontation, but had established new protocols for international naval cooperation that were still in use. "Jesus," Williams said, reading over Tank's shoulder. "She was in command during the Spratly Islands incident? That was all over the news 3 years ago. The Pentagon credited naval leadership with preventing what could have been the start of World War III. Tank continued reading. Sarah had also led humanitarian relief operations after the devastating tsunami that had hit the Philippines, coordinating rescue efforts that had saved thousands of lives. She had been personally decorated by the governments of 4 allied nations for her role in counter-terrorism operations in the Indian Ocean. "Look at this," Morrison said, pointing to another section of her biography. "She's got a PhD in international relations from Georgetown, and she's fluent in Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean. This isn't just some career officer who got promoted through politics." Tank felt a growing sense of shame as he continued reading. Every assumption he had made about Sarah in the club had been not just wrong, but completely backwards. Far from being someone who shuffled paperwork, she had more combat experience and international operational responsibility than anyone Tank had ever served under. "There's more," Kumar said, having found additional information on a different website. "She was the youngest woman ever promoted to lieutenant commander, and she's being considered for promotion to full commander ahead of the normal timeline. The word is that she's being groomed for admiral." Admiral. Tank sat back in his chair, trying to process the full implications of what he was learning. He had tried to intimidate someone who was on track to become one of the most powerful military leaders in the world. Someone who, in 10 years, might be making strategic decisions that affected the entire United States Navy. But it was a quote from an interview Sarah had given to a military journal that really drove home the reality of his mistake. Asked about challenges facing naval leadership in the 21st century, she had said, "The modern Navy requires leaders who can operate effectively in complex international environments, coordinate with allied forces from multiple cultures and military traditions, and make decisions under pressure that can have implications far beyond immediate tactical success. The days when naval leadership could rely purely on traditional command models are over. We need officers who can think strategically, communicate across cultural boundaries, and understand that military power is most effective when it supports broader diplomatic and humanitarian objectives." Tank read the quote twice, then leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just a description of modern naval leadership. It was a philosophy that was fundamentally different from his own understanding of military service. Where he had always focused on direct action, overwhelming force, and decisive personal intervention, Sarah was describing a much more complex and nuanced approach to leadership and problem-solving. "You know what the really crazy part is?" Williams said after reading through several more articles about Sarah's career. "Everything we just read suggests that she's exactly the kind of officer who would handle tonight's situation with discretion and professionalism. She's got a reputation for developing junior officers and giving people second chances when they show genuine remorse for their mistakes." Tank looked up from the computer screen. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe you should find a way to properly apologize," Williams replied. "Not because you're worried about your career, but because you owe her the respect you should have shown in the first place." Tank considered this. The idea of seeking out Sarah to apologize was terrifying for multiple reasons. It would require him to admit the full extent of his error in judgment, acknowledge that his entire approach to the situation had been wrong, and put himself in a position of vulnerability with someone whose authority over him was absolute. But it was also the right thing to do. Tank had built his career and his reputation on taking responsibility for his actions and facing consequences with integrity. The fact that those consequences might be more severe than anything he had previously experienced didn't change his obligation to own his mistakes. "You're right," Tank said finally. "But how do you apologize to someone like that? I can't exactly call Pacific Fleet Operations and ask to speak with the commanding officer about a personal matter." Kumar had been continuing to search while the others talked. "Actually," he said, "according to this schedule I found, she's supposed to speak at a public symposium tomorrow afternoon at the Naval War College. It's about international maritime security cooperation. The event is open to military personnel." Tank looked at the details Kumar had found. The symposium was being held at 2 p.m., and Sarah was listed as the keynote speaker. It was a professional setting where his presence would be appropriate, and it would give him an opportunity to approach her in a context where their military ranks and professional obligations were clear. "That could work," Tank said. "But what do I say? Sorry I tried to intimidate you in a bar because I thought you were just some contractor. There's no way to apologize for that without sounding even worse." Williams thought for a moment. "Maybe the apology isn't just about what you said," he suggested. "Maybe it's about understanding why you said it and what you've learned since then." Tank nodded slowly. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his behavior in the club hadn't just been about alcohol and ego. It had been the result of assumptions and biases that he hadn't even realized he carried. Assumptions about what military leadership looked like, about who belonged in positions of authority, and about how strength and competence were demonstrated. "All right," Tank said, making his decision. "I'm going to that symposium tomorrow. I'm going to listen to what she has to say about naval leadership and international cooperation. And then, if I can find an appropriate opportunity, I'm going to offer a proper apology." His teammates nodded their approval. It wasn't going to be easy, and there was no guarantee that Sarah would accept his apology or that the incident would be forgotten. But it was the honorable course of action, and honor mattered more than convenience or personal comfort. As they left the internet cafe and walked back toward their quarters, Tank found himself thinking not just about the apology he owed, but about the lessons he was beginning to learn. Lessons about leadership, respect, and the dangerous assumptions that could blind even experienced warriors to the realities of the modern military. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since leaving the club, Tank felt like he might have a path forward. A path that led not just toward redemption, but toward becoming the kind of leader worthy of serving alongside officers like Sarah Chen. The Naval War College auditorium was packed with officers from all branches of the military, defense contractors, and academic researchers. Tank arrived 30 minutes early, wanting to ensure he had a good seat and could observe Sarah's presentation without distraction. He had spent most of the morning researching international maritime security, trying to prepare himself to understand the topics she would be discussing. As military personnel filed in, Tank noticed the diversity of ranks and specialties represented in the audience. There were submarine commanders, Marine colonels, Air Force liaison officers, and Coast Guard captains. The symposium was clearly considered an important professional development opportunity for officers across the spectrum of military service. Tank had chosen to wear his dress blue uniform, both as a mark of respect for the formal occasion and as a way of properly identifying himself should he have the opportunity to speak with Sarah afterward. His ribbons and insignia clearly marked him as a special operations veteran, but in this context, surrounded by senior officers with decades of experience, he felt much less imposing than he had in the club the night before. At exactly 2 p.m., Sarah walked onto the stage. Tank barely recognized her. Gone was the casual civilian attire and relaxed posture he had seen at Neptune's den. In her dress uniform, with her command insignia clearly visible and her bearing unmistakably military, she looked every inch the senior naval officer she was. But it was more than just the uniform. There was a confidence and authority in the way she moved and carried herself that spoke of someone completely comfortable with command responsibility. This was a person who belonged on that stage, addressing an audience of military professionals about topics that could affect global security. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "Thank you for being here today to discuss what I believe is one of the most critical challenges facing naval forces in the 21st century, the need for unprecedented cooperation between allied nations in maintaining maritime security." Tank listened intently as Sarah outlined the complex web of international relationships, economic interests, and security concerns that shaped modern naval operations. She spoke about coordination between American, Japanese, Australian, and South Korean naval forces in the Pacific, describing exercises and operations that involved thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in military assets. The old model of naval power projection, Sarah continued, was based on the idea that superior technology and firepower could solve maritime security challenges through decisive action. While technology and firepower remain important, they are no longer sufficient. Modern naval operations require cultural understanding, diplomatic sensitivity, and the ability to build trust and cooperation with allied forces who may have very different approaches to military organization and decision-making. As Sarah spoke, Tank began to understand how profoundly his own approach to leadership differed from what she was describing. His training and experience had emphasized individual excellence, unit cohesion, and the ability to achieve objectives through direct action and overwhelming force. These were valuable capabilities, but they represented only one dimension of modern military effectiveness. Sarah described a recent operation in which Pacific Fleet forces had worked with Filipino, Indonesian, and Malaysian naval units to combat piracy and human trafficking in the South China Sea. The success of the operation had depended not on superior American firepower, but on the ability to coordinate between forces with different languages, protocols, and command structures. The American commander, who insisted on American procedures and American decision-making protocols, would have failed completely, Sarah explained. Success required understanding that our Filipino allies had developed anti-piracy tactics based on decades of local experience, that Indonesian naval traditions emphasized different approaches to maritime patrol, and that Malaysian forces brought capabilities and knowledge that complemented rather than duplicated our own strengths. Tank found himself taking notes, genuinely engaged with concepts that were entirely new to his understanding of military leadership. The idea that effectiveness could come from adaptation and cooperation rather than dominance and control challenged assumptions he had never questioned. Sarah moved on to discuss the role of naval forces in humanitarian operations, describing how Pacific Fleet resources had been used to provide disaster relief, medical assistance, and infrastructure support to civilian populations across the Pacific. She showed photographs of American naval personnel working alongside local civilians to restore power grids, deliver medical supplies, and evacuate refugees from natural disasters. Military power that cannot be leveraged for humanitarian purposes is incomplete, Sarah stated. Our ships, aircraft, and personnel represent resources that can save lives and build international goodwill when used appropriately. But this requires training our officers and sailors to think beyond traditional combat roles and to understand their broader responsibilities as representatives of American values and interests. Tank thought about his own training and deployment experiences. He had been prepared to fight and win battles, to complete missions under the most dangerous circumstances, and to overcome any obstacle through determination and skill. But he had never been trained to think about the broader implications of military action, the importance of cultural sensitivity, or the value of building long-term cooperative relationships. During the question and answer session that followed Sarah's presentation, Tank listened to the sophisticated discussions between audience members and the speaker. Officers asked about budget implications of international cooperation, the challenges of joint training exercises, and the political complexities of maintaining alliance relationships during periods of diplomatic tension. Sarah's answers were detailed, nuanced, and demonstrated a depth of knowledge that went far beyond military tactics and strategy. She spoke knowledgeably about international law, economic policy, cultural anthropology, and diplomatic history. This was clearly someone who understood that modern military leadership required expertise across multiple disciplines. As the symposium concluded and the audience began to disperse, Tank felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. The presentation had given him a much deeper understanding of Sarah's capabilities and perspectives, but it had also made the magnitude of his behavior the previous night even more clear. He had tried to intimidate someone whose intellectual and professional qualifications were far beyond his own. Tank waited near the side of the auditorium as Sarah spoke with several senior officers who had approached her after the presentation. He recognized a Navy captain, 2 Marine lieutenant colonels, and what appeared to be a civilian defense contractor. The conversations looked serious and professional, focusing on implementation details for some of the international cooperation initiatives Sarah had discussed. After 20 minutes, the group dispersed, and Sarah began gathering her materials from the podium. Tank approached slowly, his heart rate elevated in a way that reminded him of approaching a hostile position during a combat mission. "Ma'am," Tank said when he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Lieutenant Commander Chen?" Sarah looked up from her briefcase and immediately recognized him. Her expression became guarded, but not hostile. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," she said with professional courtesy. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Ma'am, I came specifically because I needed to speak with you," Tank said, working to keep his voice steady. "About last night, about my behavior and the things I said." Sarah studied his face for several seconds, seeming to evaluate his sincerity and intentions. "I told you that conversation was forgotten," she said finally. "There's no need to revisit it." "With respect, ma'am, there is a need," Tank replied. "Not because of any military obligation or concern about consequences, but because I owe you a proper apology and because I learned some things about myself last night that I need to address." Sarah's expression softened slightly. She had been approached many times by junior officers seeking to manage potential career damage from various mistakes and indiscretions. But something about Tank's tone and demeanor suggested that his motivations were more complex than simple damage control. "All right," Sarah said. "But not here. There's a coffee shop across the street from the War College. We can talk there." 10 minutes later, they were seated at a small table in a quiet corner of a cafe that clearly catered to military personnel and defense contractors. Sarah ordered black coffee. Tank asked for the same, though he normally preferred cream and sugar. He was too nervous to think about personal preferences. "Before you say anything," Sarah began, I want you to understand that your behavior last night, while inappropriate, wasn't unusual. I've dealt with similar situations many times throughout my career. The assumption that a woman in military leadership must be incompetent, inexperienced, or inappropriately promoted is something I encounter regularly. Tank felt his face flush with shame. Ma'am, I don't think that's what I was assuming. I mean, I didn't think about your gender as a factor in— Petty Officer Rodriguez? Sarah interrupted gently. One of the things you'll learn as you advance in rank is that our unconscious assumptions often drive our behavior more powerfully than our conscious thoughts. You may not have been deliberately thinking about my gender, but the way you approached me, spoke to me, and tried to establish dominance over me followed patterns that are very familiar to women in military leadership. Tank considered this carefully. He had never thought of himself as someone who treated women differently or who held sexist attitudes. But as he reflected on his behavior the previous night, he began to see how his actions might have been influenced by assumptions he hadn't recognized. You're right, Tank said finally, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm also sorry for something more fundamental. I approached you with arrogance and disrespect because I assumed that my experience and my position gave me authority over you. I was wrong about your rank and your role, but even if I had been right, my behavior would still have been inappropriate. Sarah nodded appreciatively. That's a more mature understanding than I expected, she said. What changed your perspective? Tank told her about his research the previous night, about learning the details of her career and assignments, and about attending her presentation that afternoon. He described how his understanding of military leadership had been challenged by her discussion of international cooperation and humanitarian operations. I realized that I've been thinking about military service in very narrow terms, Tank explained. My focus has always been on direct action, on achieving objectives through superior force and individual excellence. But listening to you today, I started to understand that there are dimensions of military leadership that I've never considered. Sarah smiled for the first time since they had sat down. Those aren't competing approaches to military service, she said. Direct action capabilities like yours are essential. Special operations forces provide options and capabilities that conventional forces can't duplicate. But they're part of a larger strategic framework that includes diplomacy, alliance building, and long-term stability operations. Tank leaned forward, genuinely interested in her perspective. How do those different approaches work together? I mean, how do you coordinate special operations with the kind of international cooperation you were talking about? Sarah's expression became more animated as she moved into professional discussion. That's one of the most challenging aspects of modern military planning, she said. Special operations can accomplish tactical objectives very effectively, but if they're not integrated with broader strategic goals, they can actually undermine long-term security interests. She described a recent situation in which special operations forces had successfully eliminated a terrorist cell, but had done so without coordinating with local government forces who were also tracking the same group. The result had been a diplomatic incident that had damaged relationships with an allied nation and made future cooperation more difficult. The special operations team did their job perfectly, Sarah explained. But the mission wasn't coordinated with the larger strategic framework, so tactical success created strategic problems. Tank found himself asking questions about command integration, intelligence sharing, and the decision-making processes that coordinated different types of military operations. Sarah's answers revealed a complexity and sophistication in military planning that he had never fully appreciated. As their conversation continued, Tank realized that he was learning more about advanced military leadership in 30 minutes than he had in months of formal training. More importantly, he was beginning to understand how his own skills and experience could contribute to larger strategic objectives. "Ma'am," Tank said after they had been talking for nearly an hour, "can I ask you a personal question?" "You can ask." Sarah replied with a slight smile. I may not answer. How did you develop this perspective on military leadership? I mean, the integration of combat operations with diplomacy and international cooperation. Is this something they teach at the War College, or did you learn it through experience? Sarah considered the question carefully. Both, she said finally. The academic framework came from advanced education, the War College, graduate school, international exchange programs. But the real understanding came from making mistakes and learning from them. She told him about an early assignment as a junior officer when she had been responsible for coordinating with Allied naval forces during an exercise in the Mediterranean. Her initial approach had been to establish clear American leadership and ensure that all participating forces followed American protocols and procedures. It was a disaster, Sarah said with rueful amusement. The Italian naval officers were offended by what they saw as American arrogance. The Spanish representatives felt like their expertise was being dismissed. And the French, well, the French were just annoyed by everything. The exercise had been technically successful, but it had damaged relationships that took years to repair. Sarah had learned that effective leadership sometimes meant stepping back, listening more than speaking, and finding ways to integrate different approaches rather than imposing a single vision. That's when I realized that military leadership isn't just about commanding your own forces, Sarah continued. It's about understanding how your actions affect the broader strategic environment and building relationships that support long-term objectives. Tank absorbed this perspective, thinking about his own leadership style and how it might need to evolve as he advanced in rank and responsibility. The conversation was giving him a framework for understanding military service that went far beyond his previous experience. Ma'am, Tank said as they prepared to leave the cafe, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me. And I want to apologize again, not just for my behavior last night, but for the assumptions and attitudes that led to that behavior. Sarah stood and extended her hand, which Tank shook with appropriate formality. Apology accepted, Petty Officer Rodriguez, and I hope you'll continue to think about these leadership challenges as you advance in your career. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah added, You know, Pacific Fleet Operations occasionally works with special operations units on international training exercises. If you're interested in seeing how direct action capabilities integrate with broader strategic operations, I could arrange for you to observe some of our planning sessions. Tank's eyes widened with surprise and genuine excitement. Ma'am, that would be an incredible opportunity. I would be honored to participate in any capacity you think appropriate. I'll have my aide contact your command structure to arrange something, Sarah said. Consider it professional development that might benefit both your career progression and our operational effectiveness. As Tank drove back to his base that evening, he reflected on the extraordinary 24 hours he had just experienced. He had begun the previous night as a confident special operations warrior who thought he understood military leadership and his place in the military hierarchy. He was ending this day with a much more complex and sophisticated understanding of modern military service and his potential role in broader strategic operations. More importantly, he had learned something about himself, about the assumptions and biases that had shaped his behavior, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, and about the value of listening and learning from people whose experience and perspective differed from his own. Tank realized that his encounter with Sarah hadn't just taught him about international maritime security or naval leadership. It had taught him about the kind of officer he wanted to become as he advanced in rank and responsibility. The kind of leader who could integrate different approaches to military service, who could build rather than dominate, and who could contribute to strategic objectives that went beyond immediate tactical success. 6 months later, Tank found himself in a Pacific Fleet operations planning session, working alongside officers from 4 different nations to design a counterterrorism training exercise. His special operations expertise was valued and respected, but it was being integrated into a comprehensive approach that included diplomatic considerations, cultural sensitivities, and long-term strategic objectives. As he listened to Sarah brief senior officers on the exercise's broader implications, Tank smiled to himself. He had come a long way from the man who had tried to intimidate a superior officer in a bar because he couldn't recognize true leadership when he saw it. The lesson he had learned was one that would serve him throughout his military career, that real strength comes not from dominating others, but from understanding how your own capabilities can contribute to larger purposes, and that the most important battles are often won not through force, but through the wisdom to recognize when force isn't the answer at all.